The development of early colonial administrative structures. A historical fiction narrative by A.R. Prologue. The Letter That Changed a Nation. London, winter of 1606. The letter was short, and it smelled faintly of wax and damp parchment. It was written in a precise, almost cold hand. By His Majesty's command, the Virginia Company of London is hereby chartered for the purpose of establishing a permanent settlement in the lands of Virginia. Sir Edwin Sandys read the sentence twice, then set the letter beside the flickering fire. Outside his window, the Thames was frozen over, as if the whole city had held its breath. No one in London yet understood that this brief document would begin one of the most complex experiments in government the world had ever seen. The birth of English America, not as a single colony, but as a laboratory of government itself. What began as an expedition for gold would become a centuries-long test of law, authority, and human ambition. Chapter 1. The Clerk of Jamestown. Virginia, 1607. When John Layton first stepped onto the muddy shore of the James River, his boots sank nearly to the ankles. He was 24, pale and slender, a clerk trained in the habits of English record-keeping, meticulous, quiet, and utterly unprepared for the feverish chaos of the New World. He had come not as a soldier or farmer, but as something rarer, a writer of laws. In his satchel were ledgers, quills, and a sealed packet from the Virginia Company, commanding that records be kept of all transactions, labor, and proceedings of governance. The Jamestown fort was barely a collection of timber walls. Smoke from a dozen fires hung over the settlement like fog. The men were gaunt from the voyage, many already ill from the brackish water. Yet among the hunger and fever, a hierarchy had begun to take shape. Captain John Smith barking orders, Edward Wingfield, the colony's first president, counting barrels of grain, and John Layton, quietly scratching in his ledger by candlelight. "If we are to survive," Smith said one night, "we must make this place more than a camp. We must make it a commonwealth." Layton nodded, though he barely understood. What did government mean in a swamp where half the men would be dead by winter? Chapter 2. Laws for the Living and the Dead. In the months that followed, Layton became the reluctant keeper of order. He recorded rations, logged punishments, and noted every death. Thomas Emery, slain by savages. Richard Mutton, died of fever. William White, executed for theft. It was Layton who wrote the orders, and it was his trembling hand that signed their fates. Still, even amid chaos, something remarkable was happening. Each week, Smith and the other officers gathered in the crude council house, a roof of reeds over rough-hewn benches, to decide questions of labor, trade, and defense. There, the first administrative structure of the English New World was born, a president and council appointed by the company, written proceedings to be sent back to London, rules of conduct adapted from martial law but softened for civilians. It was fragile and flawed, a democracy in name, but an oligarchy in truth. Yet to Layton's astonishment, it worked. Men followed written orders more than shouted ones. Records gave legitimacy. The colony began to feel less like an expedition and more like an institution. Chapter 3. A Message from London. In 1609, a new ship arrived with a new charter. The Virginia Company, impatient with slow profits, demanded greater control. The colony would now have a governor with near absolute power. The new man was Sir Thomas Gates, a soldier hardened by war. He believed in order above all. His first act was to issue laws divine, moral, and martial, a brutal code that punished laziness, blasphemy, and theft with whippings, branding, or death. Leighton was ordered to make 3 copies of the code, one for the governor, one for the chapel, and one to be read publicly every Sunday. He obeyed, but with growing unease. He had come to believe that records were meant to preserve justice, not to enforce tyranny. That night he wrote a secret letter to the company's council in London. If this colony is to thrive, it must be governed not by fear, but by consent. We are Englishmen, not subjects of a new Rome. He sealed it, unaware that his words would be quoted years later in a debate before Parliament.
Chapter 4. The Seeds of Self-Government. By 1619, the colony had changed beyond recognition. Tobacco fields stretched for miles. Wooden homes dotted the riverbanks. Ships came monthly from England. And with prosperity came a question no one had dared ask before. Who governs the governed? The Virginia Company, weary of the governor's harsh rule, authorized a new experiment. The General Assembly of Virginia, the first representative body in English America. John Leighton, now gray-haired and weary, sat quietly in the rear of the timber church in Jamestown as 22 elected burgesses took their seats. "We are assembled," announced Governor Yeardley, "to consult on all matters for the good of this plantation." Leighton felt tears in his eyes. 12 years ago, he had written the first crude laws by candlelight. Now before him was the birth of something greater, a system of consent, debate, and written record. The minutes of that meeting, which he himself transcribed, would later become the foundation of American legislative practice. Chapter 5. The Hidden Architect. Few in London ever knew that a quiet clerk had shaped the moral core of the colony. Leighton never held office, never commanded troops, and never grew rich. But his ledgers, the ones sent back to the Virginia Company, became the model for later colonial administrations in Maryland, the Carolinas, and Massachusetts. In them, future officials studied the importance of public record-keeping, the necessity of written law over oral decree, the balance between company authority and local self-rule. And in the margins of those ledgers, he had written a single recurring phrase: "The health of a colony lies not in its crops, but in its order." Chapter 6. The Legacy. In 1624, when the Virginia Company's charter was revoked and the colony became a royal possession, the administrative structure that Leighton had helped document endured. Governors came and went, but the habit of writing, debating, and legislating in assembly remained. From Jamestown's muddy council house to the halls of Williamsburg, and eventually to Philadelphia a century later, that same principle would echo. Government must be recorded, reasoned, and restrained. Epilogue. The Ledger. When Leighton died in 1626, his effects were few: a Bible, a quill knife, and his worn ledger, its pages brown with age, its ink faded to ghostly gray. On the last page, written in an unsteady hand, were his final words: "We came to make profit, and found instead the making of a people. Let every order, every judgment, and every freedom be written, that no man may rule by memory alone." Centuries later,
When historians examined those ledgers in the British archives, they found in them not just records of rations and laws, but the DNA of American democracy itself.